I'm actually quite warm in my clothes and voice here for in presenting. I just came from presenting a large presentation on how the Swedish pension system works. So if you have questions about that, we can take those afterwards. But hello, my name is Emil. I'm one of the co-founders of Debricked. We were founded 2018 in May. I just got that question. So, and I head up the data department. We have some of my data people here as well, where we do analysis in terms of security, compliance, and community on all open source in the world. That's a lot of fun. We actually have a full-on hardware clone of GitHub. And yes, it is possible to fit all commits on GitHub into one MySQL table. So that's good knowledge. Good. So the explosion of open source has probably not, it's not a surprise to anyone today. If you put the hindsight hat on, it can be quite interesting to look at, if you look at the downloads from one of the most popular package managers for a popular language, Python, those have increased by 360% the past 2 years. So I mean, the usage of open source is really going up. And it's not only like usage of open source that have increased a lot, but also the contributions and building these projects. If we look at the amount of version releases on the same package manager site, we can see that those have increased 69% year by year between the last years. So it's quite intense how much open source is being used and how much open source is being built. Mark Andreasen is one of the founders of Y Combinator, famous startup incubator in Silicon Valley. He coined the phrase that software is eating the world in 2011. So he was right about that. But since he coined that phrase, the growth in open source building and the releasing of packages has grown by 2,600%. So open source is definitely a part of the growth in overall software use, and I would say a large driver in that whole space. So this also affects companies, of course. Looking into the industry, we can see that we can measure open source penetration. If we look at line by line, the codes being executed, how many of those are open source lines? In 2015, this was about 35%, and this has increased drastically. So we're closing in on 90% in most, as an all industry average. Of course, this differs a lot between industry, telecom lagging a bit behind, for instance, and also car manufacturers lagging a little bit in that index. Yeah. And the impact of open source on those companies is severely good as well in a lot of context, in terms of that if you look at high performers or high performing companies in terms of revenue and growth, and compare those to low performing companies within the sector that builds software, we can see that it's 75% more likely that they use open source extensively in high-performing companies. And it's also that the high-performance company have a significantly higher chance to actually attribute their success to their open source as well. And so a number that's not here is that they're actually, to a higher extent, planning to expand their open source usage as well. So open source is growing in terms of community, in terms of usage and importance within the industry to most metrics, if you look at it closely. But there are some challenges within this as well, of course. Typically, you talk about license and compliance here, and that BMW had to open source all the code within the i3 model, because they accidentally got a GPL in there. And we are all heard, probably Log4j has not gone on the radar for any one of us, I think. But looking at the tech debt perspective of using open source. I brought one of my data scientists, Magnus, here. He is probably one of the most experienced developers in using Pony ORM. It's a good ORM, looked good a couple of years ago, but the community has quite died out. And if you ask him, he would probably recommend you use something else today. So this can be a bit controversial, but in essence, if you are using dead open source project, you can also view that through the lens of tech debt. That this is something you need to maintain yourself if you want to update it, and you can't ride, or even in some cases, such in the Pony case, get our pull requests merged that we have contributed because no one is there to accept them. We have some other cases here as well. I love documentation. I really like good documentation. And as a data scientist, Python is my weapon of choice, and I've built my fair share amount of Flask APIs. That's good. I discovered this library a couple of years ago. It's called Flask REST Plus. It does some things automatically for me in the Flask APIs. It helps me with marshalling of output, input validation as well, and exceptional documentations for my API that's automatically generated from code. Great. So we started using this, and everything was good, but then we started running into, okay, this is not a mature community yet. We're looking at to have some contributions, and Magnus as well here started to contributing to doing some contributions to that project. But it turned out, looking at the number of commits, it had completely flatlined. It's a real problem with maintainer burnout if you have a project that gains some attraction and you're a sole developer on that, and maybe that doesn't interest you anymore, and you might give up the burden of maintaining that. And that was the case for Flask REST Plus. The maintainer went completely rogue, and he was the only one with merge rights, so no contributions to that package could be made. Looking at some charts here as well, this like full disclosure, this is part of a tool that we're building. It's open, and everyone can search for any repository or package and view these types of things. But looking at the core team commitment was really low, 0 actually for this particular package, meaning that even though we wanted to help and contribute, there was no one there to take care of those contributions and make sure that they're published as a package and so on. But this is not the end of the story. The community actually forked the project and started a new separate project. This is actually really rare that this works and takes off and so on if you look at the data. But for this particular case, this worked fantastic. Flask RESTX, it's a one-on-one fork. We could early on just change the import and everything worked fine. And we had a lot better core team commitment. The longevity of the contributors were greater, and maybe most importantly, the diversity of the community was also a lot better. Meaning that the truck factor that I will talk more about, that if there is only one developer that needs to stop maintaining the project dies. It's a lot less likely for this particular fork. And this is a quite common story. Like if you, I used to like in the sales calls and so on. I used to, we've all imported this project and regretted it because it died out and so on, and people laugh. So this is a really common story within the open source community, and it's good. We need to not only discriminate on open source that's not long-term viable, but also build a healthier community all around in the open source ecosystem to make sure that we have mechanisms in place so there are takeover processes of dead open source projects if we want to. But this actually creates another problem which can be a bit more severe than just our pull requests not being merged. Log4j happened. That one was undiscovered for, I don't remember, but it was, I think it was in 2016, if I'm not wrong. That I should have checked that. But I did some analysis in our database, and it turns out that the average from vulnerable code entry, so first when you commit and push a new version with vulnerable code, until you've discovered that you have vulnerable code and disclose the vulnerability for that code, is on average 800 days. So that means if we look back on RESTX, REST Plus, here the vulnerabilities that may have entered here are still yet to be discovered, and no one can actually fix those. And for RESTX, there are vulnerabilities from in the parts of the code that's from REST Plus. So this creates another challenge of like why the open source has to be maintained, and it's important that it is in the long term. OpenSSL, when Heartbleed hit, OpenSSL was viewed as a done open source project, and that it didn't need any larger active community. So then the question becomes like, how do we pick this? Like, how can we predict what open source actually will thrive in the long term? If I commit to this now, will my future self or future colleagues take the hit for my bad choice? And how can I make these like more educated guesses? It turns out that it's actually quite when we mapped out today what's important and what people actually do when picking and looking at different open source projects and trying to make this prediction only from the GitHub page and so on. There is some consensus around the process and what people actually do, but there's also a lot of fragmentation. This one is a bit messy, but I think what the most important thing is that people look at security license and compatibility. Functionality is the trumps on more or less everything. You want to solve your problem, even if it's a live community or not, and that there's almost always a team discussion involved to bring this into a higher level of just me choosing open source projects. So let's start in the falling end of this, like what projects fail and kind of why, and trying to understand this. So I've consumed a lot of research on this, and there are some good papers out there looking at these different types of aspects, what open source has failed and what has correlated with that and so on, and why contributors leave projects such as the main contributor left REST Plus. It's actually due to either you can divide this into the project team, or the environment, where some things you can actually kind of understand and look at, while the environment may be harder to predict. So looking at one of the most common one is that it's usurped by a competitor, and in reality that means that Amazon releases its internal thing that competes with your open source project and maintains it really well. Well, then there's gonna flock a bunch of the community may go to the Amazon project instead. And this is really, really common that there are community-driven projects that are growing and getting some traction, and then Google and Amazon and Microsoft open source their competing solution, and then there is no space left within that problem setting for that open source project. This kind of goes into the obsolete part as well, but obsolete is more like you are building a small patch for a Linux problem, but then Linux kind of patches that themselves, and then you don't need that open source project anymore. It's also a quite common way that projects are usurped. And then there's two really interesting ones, I think. Lack of time and lack of interest. A lot of these projects are maintained by open source maintainers and contributors that do this besides their working hours and besides their normal paydays. Then time becomes a real factor in this, and the long-term commitment can get tricky. And all in all, it is projects. The project properties are the most common ones to say that this becomes obsolete. An environment is even though that usurped by a competitor is the single most common one, the environment is the least common. But I think there are some interesting takeaways from this. These findings, that some things you can actually kind of look for beforehand, like like in the lack of time, a lack of interest in the team, you can kind of see like, okay, how large is the team? If one developer or maintainer stops contributing to this project, will this be the end of that project or not? Is there some redundancy here, and so on? And now, like looking at why projects fail, we can also kind of try to understand which of these projects fails. Like, and there are some different correlations here as well, which I think can be quite interesting to look at. And like when saying those out loud, some of them may seem kind of obvious. Like, is there a good continuous integration service in the repository? Does the tests run automatically in the project, and so on? Yeah, that actually correlates quite a lot with that their project will be successful. So what we see here is a random sample of about 5,000 repositories, and we have the amount, the numbers that have each property of the ones that failed. We look at the top performers of these repositories. We look at the bottom performers, and then we have a random sample of these repositories to kind of indicate if there is signal in this particular, for each particular property. And what we can see here is that top performers really usually have really good CI integrations, while failed have a lot. That set has a lot lower penetration of CI integrations. And looking at contributing, so this is, if you look into open source projects, you usually have this contributing guidelines, the contribute.md. It may seem kind of obvious that this is, if you have that, and if you have good guidelines to how can I support this project if I wanted to, then it will be long-term contributed too. But do developers really look at this when choosing open source projects day by day? That is something that never appeared in our research when we did our focus groups and interviews. No one looked at contributing.md, which is the largest indicator of success, long-term success here. Coming into another part, looking at which project fails, is a quite common metric within the ecosystem called truck factor. It states that how many of the developers have to simultaneously leave the project for it to be dead. And by being dead, it means that there is no new major developer picking up the project. Which is quite interesting here, which is something you can quantitatively analyze and get information on for each particular project. We have two charts here. They're a bit more complex. So they are predicting truck factor developer detachment. It means that all truck factor developers are major, or all core team contributors in a project leaves the project for 1 year. So when you had truck factor detachment, it is almost 66% of the cases where you had that projects died. They only had one core maintainer in the project, and 24% for 2 core maintainers, and then it goes down. So if you have 3 core maintainers in one open source project, the likelihood of it having this truck factor detachment becomes significantly lower, which means that looking at that there is an active core team community within the project becomes a quite important factor to looking to the long-term support of this open source project. In our REST Plus example, it was really clear that there was only one person really maintaining this project. And also looking at the representation of these truck factor events, that in the total scope 57% of those truck factor events actually happened on repositories where you only had one single core maintainer. So this is definitely a thing to look out for when trying to analyze if a project will prevail or may fall. So I think now we come in to a little bit more of another take on this question, like what projects rise. This is different. This is more like predicting a rising stock, and no, I don't think anyone really has the hidden formula to that yet. So there's probably no hidden formula here either. But there are some. We can put on our hindsight hats again and look at what has actually happened in the history. So looking at the stars of a project and doing looking at 1 year back over time. So this was a fixed time. About 1.5 years ago, they looked at the top 5,000 projects on GitHub as well, and how they have gained their stars, which is quite interesting. So if you cluster these different types of ways of attracting new users, you can see definitely that there are different groups of trending upwards. It's more common to trend upwards in a slow and kind of stable manner. You gain about 27% of your new stars base each year, and this is quite a lot more common. Then there's the second largest base is the moderate growth. Then moderate growth of only 100% new stars each year kind of puts. I think this puts it into perspective of the growth of open source overall. Like this is moderate. Then we have the fast and the viral growth, where we're looking at more cases that are large companies solving hard problems and then open sourcing the solutions. Then those can gain a lot of stars really fast. I think the best example I have is when Netflix open sourced the Metaflow. They gained a lot of stars in a couple of hours for that one, mine included. And then they have the viral growth, where we're looking at 2,500% plus of growth in 1 year, which is quite insane. But we can actually look at like why, kind of understand which one, why do some projects get viral growth or fast growth, and why do some projects get a bit more slow and steady growth. And we can actually look at quite different things. And I think this is a bit hard to read, but let's spend some time on it because I think it's super interesting. We can see that this black thing here is more slow growth, and then we have the faster growers here, and we have this split on language to begin with. So we have Ruby as a slow and steady grower here. We are coming into CSS, PHP. That maybe that should be faster. I don't know. PHP has been around for a while as well, still on the lower end spectrum. Then we have JavaScript in the middle of the pack. That's interesting. And Python there, shouldn't that be higher? Objective-C. Then we're going to C, Go, and Old Reliable here is on the top of fast growth. Does anyone have a guess why? Part of the answer is that, but they're more specific. This data is around, this is a little bit older, I think it's from around 2017, 18. No? Yeah, so we have a guess on Spotify, we have a guess on large corporations open sourcing Java projects, but exactly. So we had a guess on Android, and that is exactly that. So we have a really large and trending in going mobile in about that time, and that's probably still true. And Android is a lot of Android applications are Java-based. So developing open source stuff for Android was really was a recipe for success in terms of open source. But then it becomes interesting again, like web. The web is a slow grower. That's interesting. And then we have documentation as the fastest growing open source communities. It turns out that the rules of the free market still applies to open source. Web development is really popular. And if it's really popular, a lot of open source is produced around web development, and then it becomes a question of how many open source projects do we produce and how many actually need them. In web development, we have really clear leaders in the industry. We have Angular, we have React, we have Vue, and we have and all their friends. Competing with those is quite hard. While in documentation, like I like documentation. I know my team, especially Anton, likes documentation, but that is usually not the case everywhere. That you seldom complain that there's too little, there's too much documentation everywhere. So it turns out that if you want to build a really popular project, you need to build Java and Android documentation projects. Yeah, I'm more into machine learning, so I'm gonna stick to that. One thing that I think is comforting here as well is that it doesn't matter in reality if it is a large corporation that open source it or owns the open source project, or an individual user. I think that's quite nice to know. And then this one shows the bias here as well. That of course the top there is some bias in this data. Of course we have some viral growths that are growing past everything, and then we have the slow and steady because that's how we have sliced the data in this particular research. So there is definitely some bias here. But yeah. So the need for documentation is definitely there. But there's also like other aspects of open source that kind of predicts the rise as well. So if we look into like these trends and look into the different indications of the popularity of a project, we can see that we have if we look at age and star, commits and stars, contributions and stars, and forks and stars, we can see that there are actually correlations here as well. Also, I think it's reassuring that the age of the project is not a too indicating factor. It's not that it's about the idea and how you execute it, not that you need to maintain, not that you need consistently push on for a while. So that's I think that's quite interesting as well. But there are there are definitely correlation between like how active your community is within the within how many changes you submit to the code base and how many active contributors you have to your project.
Sorry, Emil, I have to ask. Are you saying that if you have a buggy version? Okay, great. This might be an obnoxious question, but if you have a buggy version, then you interpret that as a popularity if you got bug fixes?
No, what I'm saying is that commits correlates with stars.
Okay,
And
so
there are definitely there's definitely parts here of the in these data points that there's no correlation, or like there's no indication. We have a lot of commits and very few stars.
okay.
But there's also, I mean, that's a hard question. That's usually what I sit with daily when I build metrics around open source. Like, the question is, are a lot of vulnerabilities, is that good or bad? It's a hard question. In the end, I think in terms of those types of questions, it's about looking at broader aspects in terms of the community and things that we know of. We know that reviews correlate strongly with better code entering the main branches of the repository. So looking at reviews and for how many commits in what review aspect and your review behavior, how many vulnerabilities maybe should you have, and so on. So there are definitely aspects in that as well that is very interesting.
Can I hold the mic just for a second?
Yeah.
I'm feeling like a coach.
Yeah, but I put me on the spot.
Doing the measurement on stars to indicate popularity, I mean, I would venture that one of the most popular open source libraries around, used for grabbing web stuff from a computer, a Swedish open source project, probably has very few stars, but is used by everyone. Wouldn't you agree on that?
I would definitely agree on that. So I think
this is confusing. Sort of, it doesn't take the whole picture.
No, it doesn't. I completely agree. Large in all, this is an unsolved problem in how you measure open source. We are a company that measures open source, and we are not perfect on that. There's the Chaos community, if anyone has heard of those. It's a Linux Foundation-owned community that specializes in measuring open source. We are on the more measure everything. They are more measure one thing really deeply. And looking at what are actually good indications of popularity, of contribution activity. Is code change, as you said, is that a good indication? And not always. And in my take there, it's a trade-off. We need signal somehow. We need to have some indication of popularity when choosing projects. And so we need to build redundancy into those models so that one part of the model cannot have the full indication of the story. Commits are good, but you need to reference those into the bug saturation in the issues and how long it takes to merge a pull request from an external developer and things like that. It's a larger picture. But I think the most important thing there is that you can't measure open source in absolutes, which we do here. And that's inaccurate. Open source is relative. What you compare your Swedish open source thing that builds the foundation of maybe the Swedish software world.
No, actually, this is something that is automatically installed in everybody's computer that is used on Earth.
Yeah.
So that's why it doesn't get stuck, because people don't have to. Sorry.
People don't have to download it themselves. It's when you open your Apple computer, it's there. When you open your Windows computer, it's there, or Linux. So,
yeah. But my point there is if you want to analyze that in terms of its popularity, it doesn't make sense to compare it to Vue. It makes sense to compare it to similar functionality open source projects and doing that type of grouping, because that's you're not choosing between this open source project and Vue. You're choosing between similar functionality open source project, and you need to do and you need to compare those. And the most maybe. I've get a lot of questions, since we work in a lot of research in this, I naturally get questions on the research projects, how should I measure my research project? I don't get a lot of citations, but I get a lot of stars and downloads on my project. Yeah, then you compare to other projects that have the similar setup. There are a bunch of within machine learning of all the model projects and so on that have the similar setup. That's what you compare to. So it's a relative comparison to your problem space and what is deemed normal and good within that problem space. Is my line of thought, is my opinion on this matter. I would love to hear if you have other thoughts. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. But since pizza is coming up quite soon, can we predict if an open source project fails or not? And my answer is like, yeah, kinda. Kinda, you can predict that. We have models, and we've tried to, like, with hindsight, try to build the models that predict the rise and fall of open source. And currently, like, the human in the loop there is really good. You need just need good indications of where you need to spend your time and look. So if you have surprisingly many commits in a project that shouldn't have that commit or code churn in a project, indicating that they're exchanging a bunch of things, indicating that they're fixing bugs. Like, that's something you need to spend time on and look at, and is that normal for the particular problem you're trying to solve? I think that's one of the main things I've learned analyzing all these open source data, that it depends on the context of the problem you're trying to solve. To finish off, like, looking at it can become quite weird talking about open source in terms of, like, yeah, it's risky, and it's there's tech debt involved, and vulnerabilities, and license and compliance, and so on. But it's important to remember that this carries, like, if software is the foundation of our modern digital revolution, I mean, then open source is a very large percentage has a very large percentage to attribute to that success. So I think enabling organizations and developers to use more open source and better open source in a smarter way, and building systems that contributes back efficiently to that type of ecosystem is vital in the future of the acceleration of software development. And just some key takeaways, like, that I think, like, looking at the open source usage, like, high performers want to use more open source software. That's great. I think looking at, traditionally, organizations look at security and compliance. Community is an important part of that. I think we need to involve the tech debt discussion in terms of open source as well. Just to wrap it up, something that we haven't touched upon too much, like, developers love contributing to open source. This is a clear, this is one of my favorite numbers, that this is a super clear correlation between employee happiness and making it easy to contribute to open source, and actually helping them enabling them to do that. So help your developers contribute also. Maybe, like, one last thing. We're growing in the team. I'm recruiting a bunch of data engineers and data scientists. If you think open source is fantastic to analyze, we're looking at everything from accurately determining the version and license of open source project, to predicting security patch and trying to automatically fix vulnerabilities within open source projects, and using everything from state-of-the-art machine learning to we have a really nice deployment of Neo4j's graph database, how all open source uses all other open source, and I'm really excited about using that one right now. So a lot of fun things going on at Debricked. So if you're interested, just talk to me or any of my team. We have a bunch of Debrickters here as well. Good.
The popularity of, for example, a library with the amount of mentions on, for example, Hacker News or Reddit, to be able to predict if the marketing is doing the magic?
Interesting. Yeah. So we do some things on Stack Overflow. So we scrape a lot of Stack Overflow mentions and so on. and look at that type of and we haven't done like explicit correlation in terms of like, okay, stars, downloads, and Stack Overflow mentions, but it's definitely could definitely be interesting to look at. But like what I can show you like what part of what we're building. So this is so we have this open source search engine for open source searching any open source software. You can filter for package manager and different license and different things. And here we have like part of the charts I showed you earlier, where you can see things such as contribute the experience of the contributors, how many merge requests they have in this repository, as well as in all other repositories on GitHub and so on. So here we have like some data on what we call ecosystem bus and so on. And I think this actually correlates like I don't want to say it because I read Thinking Fast and Slow, but in my opinion, from looking at a lot of these pages, I think this and this correlates. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, just a quick one. Have you been looking at money? Some developers get sponsorships, or Patreon, or coffee cash, or beer cash, etc. How does that? Can you predict something from that? Like, how much money are they making from it?
I haven't looked at it myself. I read some research on it, and that money is a bad indicator of success in open source projects. I think that research stated, if I remember correctly, that it takes quite a lot of money to do that on full time, and you don't, even if you get more money, that doesn't mean you can work part-time on your other job when you need that security of a stable income. So the time still becomes the blocker here. And I think like parts of that is like, I think there is a problem with how funding, like money, is distributed in software development, because like we can discuss controversies around like Elasticsearch and so on, and I love that. I love the search engine, and we use that as part of this one as well. But like how they basically forked an open source community project and built a company on that, and then and so on. So like the whole core of Elasticsearch is like an open source community that they did not participate in. And the moral of that, I think, is that there is definitely a challenge here. And we are an SEA tool vendor, so like we scan customers for like vulnerabilities and so on. We know exactly what open source they use, how much, and so on. And I like one day maybe we can do some business innovation as well, and not only technical innovation, and try to distribute, maybe have some type of stream of like, okay, part of our license fee goes into the open source projects that you use, depending on how much you use them and so on. I think there are like models like that. There are also interesting projects around like blockchain technology and contributions and so on. That's happening in the space. Anything else? How's it going with the pizza?
Thank you for the super interesting presentation. My question is that what does the company Debricked name mean, and how did you and your co-founder start the business?
Yeah, good question. So Debricked, it's an old saying that you brick something. You know that there was a bug in iPhone a couple of years ago. So if you set the time to day 0 in computer world, so 1970, 1st January, you would brick the phone. So then there was a software bug that meant that you couldn't update it, you couldn't open it, it just was a black screen, it was bricked. So that's an old saying, that you brick something, and then we debrick it, is kind of the word catch there. And we're actually founded from Lund University. So it's me and 3 other co-founders. Martin Hell, if any of you went to Lund University and studied computer science, you probably had him in security courses. He did a lot of research on the matter of application security and in terms of open source, and that became Debricked in the end. And I joined in just as the company started. So, and it's quite a long, like 3.5 years ago. Like it was me and Martin was still at university, and Daniel, the CEO, like some really early employees, we shared a desk in like this really shitty room on Mink, and it was a lot of grind, a lot of fun. And today we're closing in on 45 employees, and we're scaling up quite a lot. So I'm doing we're 3xing the data science team this year, and we're probably looking at I think another 15 developers as well this year. So we're hopefully end up at around 80 end of year. So it's a journey to start a company. So maybe it's beer and mingle time then. Oh. Thank you very much for listening in.